Welcome to week 9. We've got a challenging discourse of Jesus's to study for this week, his fifth and final discourse in the Gospel of Matthew, situated almost seamlessly here in the flow of the narrative. I am just about done with grading the working papers submitted a week ago, and just have a few more of those to finish, and I should get those back to you in the next couple of days. A brief comment on the working papers and just the kind of challenge of biblical interpretation that I think all of us are experiencing in a class like this. And I also want to say a few words about some of the pitfalls for interpreting Matthew 24 to 25, as well as a word about the Josephus reading that I've assigned, and finally an optional resource that I'll have for you on the meaning of Gehenna, Hades, and eternal fire in the Gospel of Matthew. All of those terms, but especially Gehenna and Hades, often translated as simply hell or interpreted along the lines of the kind of traditional understanding of the post-mortem plight of the individual soul. So about these working papers and just the challenging art of biblical interpretation, I think that many of you have begun to see the challenge of doing two seemingly opposite things at once. You've got to deal with the big questions, the large claims that the story is making, and at the same time you've got to study the tiniest details and the most intricate textual subtleties. I just want to encourage you to continue to try to strike that balance, to refuse to give up on either one of those poles, but to always be working between them in a healthy tension. The temptation is to begin to discover, perhaps in the Gospel of Matthew, some extraordinary and moving claims about who God is, about how the kingdom of God is being revealed, who Jesus is as the Messiah, etc., what life is according to the words of this story, and then to sort of find yourself victimizing the details of the story in order to advance those large claims, so that the details simply are sort of diluted. They just kind of represent this bigger picture, and in the course of interpretation are just lost. The other extreme, of course, is becoming so consumed with untangling the details of the text of this story that the larger and abiding claims and questions of the story are lost and are exerting no pressure on what you're doing in your attempt to puzzle through the details. I think that you'll find that as you're able to hold these two poles together in a healthy tension, that you are able to communicate what the gospel according to Matthew teaches with a great deal of power. If you just have the sort of big questions, big claims, without the color and the nuance of the details, they will tend to be cliche and platitudinous and simply confirm what you already wanted to believe anyway. Whereas if you get lost in the details, they don't really intrigue us any more than a crossword puzzle or any other kind of labyrinth. So what you want to strive for is an interpretation of the text that captures some of its in cosmic scope, its political drama, and yet does so uh, in and through even the smallest of details of the text, tracing the themes, but also seeing how a sound interpretation does something with all of the details that the text gives us and doesn't minimize any of those details in the service of some larger set of claims. So continue to strive for that. It is an art, it's a subtle art, but it's an important one for us to learn because it is how the story shapes us, how the text of Scripture shapes us, challenging some of our existing assumptions and patterns of speech, and it's also how the story empowers us to teach it to others in a way that is transformative. Okay, the text for this week, as I said, is deeply challenging because it is full of language and imagery that most of us come to the text associating with the end of the world, some kind of mythological scenario at the end point of time. And I want to just be upfront and tell you that I'm going to be arguing against that sort of interpretation of Jesus' final discourse. It's certainly the form of interpretation, you might say, of these words that I inherited, regarding them as about the end of the world, the second coming of Christ, or something like that. But I've come to think that that does not actually fit the arc of the narrative, what the abiding concerns of the story are, or the particular occasion of the discourse at the beginning of chapter 24 and in its place in the drama of Matthew. Also significant, I suppose, to my interpretation and the challenge to a lot of our received tradition about how to understand these words is the nature of Old Testament language. We tend to come to this discourse of Jesus's with some sort of understudied perceptions about what the Old Testament language of the prophets is about. So, for example, when Jesus quotes Isaiah 13 to talk about the stars falling from the sky and the moon's light being hidden, our minds immediately go to a kind of mythological end of the world scenario where the text is primarily about astronomical phenomena that we have a very difficult time even associating with anything about our lived reality today. But of course, in Isaiah 13, where Jesus is quoting from, a little bit of Isaiah 34, the falling of the stars from the sky is about the fall of Babylon and then the fall of Edom. And so we need to respect the Old Testament currency of the words that Jesus uses in our attempt to make sense of what he is saying with them, as opposed to simply losing sight of that Old Testament home of the words and doing with them whatever our imagination as formed by some of the obsessions and insecurities of our time moves us to do. So it will be key to read carefully this week to test some of our assumptions and to take seriously how the arc of the narrative has shaped this discourse of Jesus, how the concerns of the narrative come to fruition in this context, and how the gospel sort of narrative has arranged this story in the flow of the narrative. So bear those matters in mind as you study, and you're of course welcome, as always, to differ with me, to challenge my interpretation that I'll give in my recording this week. But as you do, I want to urge you to do what you can to root your questions, your claims, your concerns in the text as much as possible, as opposed to simply reiterating a cherished belief that you've brought to this text, as important as that is. A couple of matters to bear in mind as we study this text in the context of our course. What many people, I think, neglect to notice about where this discourse sits is that it is the last thing that Jesus says, sort of in the movement of this clash with authorities in Jerusalem. The last thing that he says to his disciples before he goes to his own betrayal and Last Supper, arrest, trials, crucifixion, and death. And this is not incidental. The positioning of this discourse in relation to Jesus' death is highly significant, as have been the positions of other parts of the story. What we are seeing in this discourse is Jesus predicting what is going to be the unfolding of his own death. Jesus is saying that Jerusalem, the temple in particular, is going the way of his own body, as he has been predicting clearly to the disciples with increasing detail on the way up to Jerusalem. So don't miss the intimate relation between the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jesus' body. And it's partly the intimacy of these two events makes them one event, and finally what Jesus describes as the coming of himself as the Son of Man to power, God's human ruler for Israel over all the peoples of the world. The coming of the Son of Man, I will argue, is the coming of Jesus to power in and through his humiliating death, resurrection, the spread of his name, and finally the exaltation of his name, his power, his memory, his presence, in and through the fall of the temple, through strife within his own people, and also the invasion of Rome. Parallel, once again, to what happens to his own body, which is betrayed through strife within his own people and handed over to destruction by the Roman authority, Pilate. So, if you want to get into the details of that and hear my defense of this sort of reading of the discourse, then you'll get it in the recording that I'll be posting for this week. The other issue here that I just wanted to raise that I think some of you have begun to ask about rightly is what we are to make of Jesus' use of the terms Gehenna in particular, but also Hades, and then in chapter 25, eternal fire, eternal destruction. I think that most of you can imagine what the traditional understanding of these terms is. They're usually just translated as hell, understood as this kind of post-mortem plight of the individual soul. Once again, I think that reading them that way is a failure to actually discern their meaning in the presentation and context of the story, including what it owes to the Old Testament source of this language. I would love to devote a whole week to just focusing on that language in Matthew, but unfortunately, I just don't think that we've got time for that. I considered adding a reading on that subject for this week, but I think with preparing for your advanced interpretive papers, working with my comments on your working papers, plus the work for this week, you've got more than enough work to do. So there's nothing required on this subject for this week, but of course, I hope you'll have some time to devote to the optional resource that I will have, which will be a couple of pieces that I have written. One, some less formal notes on Gehenna, Hades, and eternal fire, and secondly, an article that I've written that deals with the ethical stakes of the question of hell in light of the meaning of Gehenna and Hades and eternal fire in Matthew in particular. So those will be available to you as optional resources, and of course I encourage you to read them. There's some overlap between them, so the notes on Matthew might be the most immediately relevant to the class. Notes on hell that deal primarily with Matthew, although some other parts of the Synoptic Gospels in particular. And you can comment on those, of course, in the second response form if you wish. But again, those will be optional and not required. You'll be reading another primary text outside of the Bible for, I think, the first time in this class in the material that I've excerpted from The Jewish War by Josephus. I expect you to read that critically as you would any of the other material we've read in the class. Josephus is not the Bible. Not that we don't read the Bible critically too, but I don't expect you to attribute to Josephus some kind of clear theological authority or anything. Nevertheless, I think that there's a lot for us to learn in his account of the Jewish war, and particularly its final chapters that led to the destruction of the temple that Jesus is describing in Matthew 24 to 25. I have assigned this because I think, as some of you began to notice in reading the Cohen article for last week, that Christians of our time have a very difficult time understanding the catastrophic scope of the fall of the temple, as well as the severity of the events that led up to it and the kind of destruction that it involved. So I've asked you to read what an eyewitness experienced, saw in this destruction, in hopes that it will enable you to appreciate as you have not before the profundity, the epic nature of this event of the fall of the temple, as opposed to relegating it to one of many exotic events in the past. This is in fact a change of age that happens with the fall of the temple because of how much of people's lives, especially Israelite lives, but even people not from Israel, Gentile people, how much of the earth's life was invested in various ways in this institution and all of its ramifications. So hopefully you'll get some sense of that, along with the cataclysmic nature of the event, given the severity of its destruction and all the really almost unspeakable suffering that was involved in that as you read Josephus's final chapters of the Jewish war. So I look forward to your responses to both our questions for the study of Matthew 24 and 25, as well as Josephus and my comments this week. The Lord bless you as you study.